Please turn to your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 16. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king will then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So we agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were given to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. Uh, this is probably considered an outdated movie by now, but the Shawshank Redemption is still one that is still sort of relevant today, and one that people may still talk about. If you're unfamiliar with the film, it's based off of an old Stephen King novel, probably one of his less horror-themed novels, about a guy named Andy Dufresne who is sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Throughout the movie, we see him befriend a fellow prisoner named Red, and we see the things that he went through while in prison until he decides to break out of the prison. After hearing about a death of an elderly inmate who committed suicide due to being unable to adjust to the outside world after being in prison for most of his life, we get this scene where Andy starts talking about hope. Andy says that hope is a good thing and it helps him get through tough times, while Red says that hope is a dangerous thing that can drive a person insane and that he should forget about hope. This not only helps establish this theme of hope that is shown throughout the film, but also the different approaches one can have when it comes to hope. Red, due to being institutionalized after being in prison for so long, ends up having a negative approach to hope, causing him to be cynical and simply believing that there's no point in believing things can get better. And you can see this whenever he is at the parole boards every time. First time he seems a bit hopeful, but then after a while he sort of like says, I'm just saying this stuff. I know you're going to reject me and I'm going to be stuck here for now. Until near the end of the movie where he pretty much just doesn't care anymore and tells him that. Andy, however, has a positive approach to hope, which helps him get through the horrifying experiences he faces while in prison. Even after the warden refuses to help Andy prove his innocence after a new inmate reveals that a person he shared a cell with admitted to the murder that Andy was accused of, he still had hope. He didn't allow the dreary atmosphere of the prison break him down and lose hope, which is why he was able to escape the prison and even change Red's approach to hope once Red had been finally released from the prison. While hope may seem like a small thing, it ends up being something that can help a person through times of difficulty. While people may argue that the only reason that Andy had hope is due to the fact that he was working on a way to break out of the prison, it still doesn't change the fact that it kept him from succumbing to the mentality of the other prisoners. He even allowed that hope to give him a chance to make some of the other prisoners he befriended to feel like a person again, even though they had forgotten what it felt like due to their long time in the prison. There was really no reason for him to do something like that, but he still wanted his fellow prisoners to feel what he felt, even though they didn't ask for something like that or didn't even realize that they could still feel something like that. Whenever I see that scene, it makes me wonder if this was something that Daniel and his three friends felt when they were being taken to the Babylonian courts. I mean, Daniel was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, only for his kingdom to be conquered by the Babylonians and essentially recruited for the empire to serve. He could have kept his head down and do what they were told, obeyed whatever they were being told to obey, but there was a part of him that still refused to do so. And while it may not seem like it when we read Daniel 1 8 through 16, Daniel and his companions are actually keeping their faith to God when they refuse to eat the king's food. First, a bit of background as to why all of this happened in the first place before getting into why Daniel's refusal of the food shows is them keeping their faith in God. During this time, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel as a result of Israel's disobedience, which is why verse 2 states that the Lord gave Jehoiakim to Nebuchadnezzar. And once Israel was conquered, Nebuchadnezzar decides to gather the youth of Israel as a way to not only prevent the Israelites from rebelling, but to also re-educate them and make them lose their national identity as Israelites. Even though it would have seemed like a good opportunity due to the fact that they're pretty much getting a free education along with free meals and housing, which, let's be honest, a lot of us would have loved that, especially if you've gone to college or are going to college. It was solely with the intent to make sure that Israel would end up becoming dependent on the Babylonian government, and that later generations would also pretty much grow up with that mindset. And you can make the argument that the reason for why Daniel refused the king's food was due to a sense of national pride. He still wanted to show his pride as an Israelite. Well, there probably was a part of him that wanted to rebel against the Babylonians, still keep his pride and national identity as an Israelite. This actually would have been a very strange way to do so. Usually in these types of situations, it would make more sense for him to reject what they were teaching him and or questioning the reasoning behind the teachings. Like point out whatever flaws he can see, or maybe like secretly telling the other youths that this is what we should learn and reject the other teachings. And simply refusing to go by his Babylonian name would have also been enough to reject the culture. Rejecting the food that he has been given seems like a strange way to do so, especially since the quality would have been better than what he would have normally received. Not only that, but does it even make sense to even consider his actions to only be a result of national pride, especially if you look through the events of this passage? Another thing to note is the fact that this passage is about the health benefits of a vegetarian or vegan diet, which unfortunately some people do use for some reason. That's a gross oversimplification of what is being shown in this passage, and if we're being honest, most likely used by someone who either didn't understand the passage or is trying to get their kids to eat more vegetables. It also doesn't make sense due to the fact that these types of health benefits wouldn't have been known during that time, and it most likely wouldn't have excluded wine from the diet. But not only that, but even if they ate vegetables that contain protein, it wouldn't explain some of the physical changes Daniel and his companions went through. Depending on the translation, it also mentioned that after the 10 days that they were also fatter in flesh, meaning that their bodies were essentially bigger than average. Not like an unhealthy fatness, but more like a healthy sort of fat look. Maybe even a slight muscular build. And maybe they were even taller too. We're not really sure. While the look healthier part is possible, maybe their skins did look cleaner and their hair is maybe, I don't know, glossier. That is actually possible. The weight gain / muscle growth, along with maybe the height growth, wouldn't have been possible with just vegetables alone, or at least if it was possible, it wouldn't have been as noticeable for them to say something like fatter in flesh. That simply wouldn't have been logical at all. Another possibility for why Daniel refused the food may be due to the laws about ceremonially clean and ceremonially unclean foods, which are shown in Leviticus 11. This does make sense due to the fact that the Babylonians would have eaten things like pork, which would have been forbidden to the Israelites. While that does provide an explanation, just like the vegetarian / vegan benefits approach, it still wouldn't explain why Daniel would refuse to drink the wine. Wine wasn't something that was forbidden, at least especially during that time. Only getting drunk off the wine was forbidden. It would have been okay for him to refuse the food and still drink the wine, but Daniel still refused both. But not only that, since Daniel and his companions were being taken care of by the chief of the eunuchs, he could have simply just asked for food that would have been considered ceremonially clean under Israelite law instead of just vegetables and water. In fact, that probably would have been easier to get instead of that stuff. It would have been probably a simple task for the chief of eunuchs in the guard, and he probably wouldn't have any reservations of giving that food as long as they looked healthy before the king. Because a purely vegetarian diet was unheard of, but the stuff that the Israelites would have eaten, that still would have been considered okay. So they wouldn't have any problems with that. And another approach that is actually pretty close to the reason for why Daniel refused the food and wine is due to the fact that the wine and the food given to them may have been offered to the Babylonian idols. This was a common religious practice that the Babylonians partook in, and there was a high probability that the food given to the Israelites may have been food given to the idols. While the explanation does make sense, it still falls short simply due to the fact that there's also still a high probability that the vegetables and water that Daniel and his companions ate may have also been offered to the Babylonian idols. The offerings to the idols would have been of the highest quality of food, the best of the crops, which the king would have access to, and that would also include the freshest vegetables, which was most likely the vegetables offered to Daniel and his friends when they're in this task. While those types of vegetables would have been the ones that were given, which means that we actually have to look for a different explanation, and that there actually is a better explanation for why Daniel and his companions did what they did. They did what they did as a way to show the Babylonian Empire that they put their trust in God and not the king to provide for them, to look after them. Maybe Daniel understood that the reason for why all this happened was due to the kingdom failing to obey God's laws. The only thing we do know is that Daniel understood that God is the one who provides for his people. Accepting the king's food would have been the equivalent of saying that they don't need God to provide for them, to take care of them. They'd be allowing themselves to become captives of the Babylonian culture. And even though the food would have been better than anything that they would have been normally able to get, highest quality, meats with the richest fat, vegetables that are fresher, wine that was probably made from the finest grapes or so, they still understood that it wouldn't be right for them to accept this food. Even though it seemed like something that wasn't a big deal, it was something that would go against what they were taught, similar to the education that Nebuchadnezzar was giving, and the free housing and everything else along with that. It was given with a negative intent, with one that would go against God's laws to make them forget about God. Refusing the king's food and restricting their diet was a way to show that they were still God's people and that they were still dependent on God, even in exile in a foreign land. We see that they were rewarded for their faithfulness to God, not only in verse 15, due to them looking healthier and stronger than the other members of their youth, but also at the end of the chapter, in Daniel 1:17-21. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. God knew that in their hearts that they were being faithful, even though their actions didn't seem like much. Most of us, let's be in that situation, would have had a hard time refusing such a thing for something as simple as vegetables and waters, nor would we have been considering it a big deal to eat the king's food. Yet, they still knew the importance of being faithful to God, even though many of us, again, would not have seen it as a big deal to just eat food that was given to us. I mean, most of us would probably have argued that eating the king's food would be a way to get back at the Babylonians somehow, claiming that it will make us stronger, and then by the time we decide to rebel, we'll be ready, or something like that. Something along those lines. Daniel and his friends knew that true strength comes from God and not from the things of the world. Even though the other fellow Israelites may have thought of them maybe crazy to refuse such expensive foods for something as simple as vegetables and water, maybe some of them even mocked them for doing such a thing, probably saying, "Oh, you're missing out on this food. Come on, look at this. This is so elegant, so fancy, so delicious. Where in the world are you going to eat something like that? Like, oh, it looks like that. It's like some type of caviar or maybe some type of fancy dessert. They still kept their faith in God, understanding that God will provide, and what he provides is greater than what the king can ever give them. Even during a time of punishment, they knew that God will be with those who are faithful. While we would like to think that we will be like Daniel and his friends when faced with a similar situation, unfortunately, we are more than likely to act like the other youths that were with Daniel and his friends. We are more than likely to conform to what the world thinks we should be like instead of what God wants us to be like, enjoying the things that the world gives us instead of understanding that what God gives us is truly greater than what it can be, than what is available. We allow to lose our faith in God, thinking that it will be okay to do what everyone else is doing since we're just simply trying to survive, that it's okay for us to do this because we are trying to live. We end up forgetting the fact that God is the reason for why we're able to succeed even in the difficult of times. God is the reason for why Jesus came to save us in the first place and why we're able to be seen as pure before him. So just like Daniel and his friends, let us always strive to remember to always be faithful before God. Even though it may not seem like it or seem like much at the time, God remembers our faithfulness and trust in him. God is the reason for why we're able to get through hardships and grow as a person. Remember to stay faithful to God and to desire to live your life for him. As it says in Proverbs 3:5-8, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Let us pray.